afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. City Club is where we bring civic-minded people together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Karen Curvin, President of City Club. I would like to welcome members and guests alike. Those of you who join us today at Sentinel Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partner, Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Echo Northwest, Chevron, Girding Edlin, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Schwabe, Williamson & Wyatt. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. I also want to thank Family Forward for partnering with us on today's program. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. We are pleased to welcome back Civic Scholars from Madison High School today. Civic Scholars is our initiative to expand opportunities for high school students to more deeply engage in Portland's civic issues, bringing civic education out of the classroom and into the community. Students, please stand if you are able, and welcome to Friday Forum. City Club is where people who love Portland work together to help solve our biggest problems. Now is your chance to love Portland back. If you're already a member of City Club, help others get involved. If you join or renew between now and May 31st, you will save $25. Also, if you join today, you will be entered into a drawing for a date night basket or Mother's Day basket. The basket has all sorts of goodies like cupcakes from Cupcake Jones and growlers from Growler Guys. You can join after the program. Just be sure to connect with a City Club staff member, or you can join online at pdxcityclub.org/join. For next week's Friday Forum, we partnered with Bravo for a conversation about the orchestra as a tool for social change. Bravo Rosa Parks launched in September 2013 with 40 students at Portland's poorest public school who had never played an instrument and couldn't read music. Now, 18 short months later, they have performed on stage alongside the Oregon Symphony. We have 2 after-hours events next week. On Monday, join us for our Leader Spotlight with Stephen Mark Boudouin, a nonprofit executive and an arts, education, and social justice advocate. On Thursday, we will host our first East Portland Forum at Pizza Baron. Chief Larry O'Day will talk with the community about the pros and cons of police using body cameras. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. After our program today, Sunny Pettit will facilitate a question and answer session with our panelists. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. For all of our audience members, please locate the index cards on the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. Hold your cards up high, and City Club staff will collect them prior to the start of Q&A. I'd also like to welcome a couple special guests to today's program. We have Brad Avakian, Commissioner, State of Oregon, Bureau of Labor and Industries. And we have Portland's First Lady, Nancy Hales. And now for our program. In recognition of Mother's Day, Latifah Lyles, Director of the Women's Bureau at the Department of Labor, and a few Oregon experts will lay out and discuss the state of motherhood in Oregon and our country. Rates of maternal poverty are high, particularly among mothers of color. What explains this, and what explains the staggering wage gaps mothers face? Most importantly, what things should we be working toward to make sure it's no longer true that motherhood is a leading predictor of poverty for women? Our keynote speaker today is Latifah Lyles, the director of the Women's Bureau at the Department of Labor. The Women's Bureau works to create parity for women in the labor force using a three-pronged approach to conduct cutting-edge research and policy analysis not replicated elsewhere, inform and promote policy change, and increase public awareness and education. She is focused on improving workplace policies for women, including paid leave, equal pay, pregnancy accommodation, and access to high-growth occupations. Latifah Lyles is currently working with the White House on the Lead on Leave Empowering Working Families Across America tour. Following our keynote, we welcome 3 Oregon experts to join her on stage for a discussion. Andrea Peluso is co-founder and executive director of Family Forward Oregon. Andrea, Family Forward Oregon, an organization founded by mothers to advance the economic insecurity that too many mothers and families who depend on them face. President Obama recently recognized Andrea as a champion of change, someone who supports working families and has helped bring about change within their communities. Dr. Eileen Duldulau is like a maternal and child health epidemiologist with the Multnomah County Health Department and primary author of the 2014 Multnomah County Maternal, Child, and Family Health Data Book. Moderating today's discussion is Sunny Pettit, Executive Director for the Center for Women's Leadership. She's passionate about the state of motherhood because every day she interacts with women of all ages who are facing inequity. Please join me in welcoming today's guest to the stage.
Thank you, Karen, for that very, very kind introduction, and thanks to everyone here at the City Club of Portland for having me. I bring greetings from the Department of Labor, Secretary Tom Perez, and Senior Advisor to the President, Valerie Jarrett, who is so sorry that she couldn't be here with us, but no, we're working very closely with the White House in moving some of these critical issues forward. I also want to acknowledge Betty Locke, who is one of my regional directors here from Seattle, who's joined me. I don't have to talk about one of the things I like to say when I'm addressing a group who wants to know about the Women's Bureau and what we do. First of all, we've been around for almost as long as the City Club. We're celebrating our 95th year this year. And one of the very, very fascinating questions we get asked all the time is, why do we need a Women's Bureau? Why don't we have a man's bureau? So recently, I've talked to the staff. We get letters and calls, and people get very flustered and want to be responsive to the public. And I certainly don't have to explain to this room why we need a women's bureau, but I will say that the work that we have done over the past 95 years for working women has always been groundbreaking, at the cutting edge, and really trying to look around the corner to address issues that relate to women in the workplace and their economic security. So it's fitting that I'm here today talking about working mothers. One of the major changes in our labor force in the past 50 to 60 years has been twofold. One, women are achieving educational advances like they never have before. And two, more and more, both parents have to work. There's not a parent at home, and the number of working and pregnant women has doubled and tripled in this country. So one of the things that we've recently done is we took a look back at a report that the Women's Bureau did with then President Kennedy 50 years ago. So in answering this question, why do we need a Women's Bureau? The answer became clear. 4 major priorities the Commission uncovered and decided was really important for this nation included making sure that women had equal pay, making sure that we had affordable child care for working parents, making sure that there were paid sick days and paid leave for working mothers, and lastly, dealing with the issue of getting women into higher paying jobs, knowing that more and more women and single women were heads of their households. That was 50 years ago. That is still our mission today. Of course, and I don't have to tell the folks in this room that we have so many gains that we can be proud of, but we know that we have so far to go. And one of the reasons I'm here, as Karen mentioned, is because the President's office, the Department of Labor, the White House have teamed up for a Lead on Leave tour. Why? Because, as you all know, the United States continues to be the only industrialized nation that doesn't provide some of these basic protections for workers. Because we know, and this is the quote the President, that some women don't even have a paid day off to give birth. Because we know that millions of families struggle every day between the decision of keeping a sick child home and putting that sick child on a school bus. Some of the issues that we're talking about on this tour, of course, affect individuals and workers. But one of the key points that we want to make as we go across the country is to talk about what this means for the United States economy. I talked about how the comparison of the United States across the world and the company that we're in, but the numbers bear out some stark realities. We know that if we had paid leave in this country in the early 2000s, there would be 5 million more women in the workforce. We know that if we had the workplace policies like Canada and the UK and other countries, that we would have 500 more million people working, and we know that we would have an increase in our GDP. This has become an institutional problem. One of the key conversations we're having with workers, employers, and policymakers is that how do we get this issue away from the individual? So many women and now fathers struggle with these problems alone. These are individual decisions. My ability to take care of my kid, find affordable childcare, and have a sick day, figure out what to do when my kid is sick, is not something that people think of generally as something other than a personal problem. And we want to change that notion. The notion that you are expected to be a productive contributor to your work environment, grow our economy, stay in the workforce, that's everybody's problem. That's not an individual problem. And we know that while we talk about women giving birth, taking care of children, in the states like California and New Jersey and Washington that have these programs, of course, California and New Jersey who have implemented these programs, it's working. The sky hasn't fallen. No one's gone bankrupt. There are real life stories of both workers and business owners, employers, who have said in these states, in California, who celebrated their 10th year of having paid leave in that state last year. It's working. It's working. And not only is it working, but everybody's using it. Dads are using it. People are using it to take care of their parents and sick relatives. It's not being abused. It's not costing money. What we know when we do, there's studies that compare us to Canada and UK and Germany, and it shows really clear outcomes for businesses. There's better loyalty. There's less cost for turnover. There's a higher rate of productivity. We have an imperative in this country today to make sure that we can do what we can to move these issues forward, because frankly, we can't afford not to. The Women's Bureau is the only agency in the federal government whose sole focus is to advance the economic security and well-being of women in the workplace. What we're doing today, leading the charge for the Department of Labor, working across the country, talking to individuals in states like Oregon, is to say that we're with you. We want to lift up these issues. We want to make sure that you know, that we know, that the change is coming at the local level. We know that sometimes change in Washington comes not from within, but to Washington. And part of our goal is to make sure not only that we talk about these issues, but we do what we can to invest in these issues as well. The President's 2016 budget invests $2 billion for states to take advantage of grant programs where they can do feasibility studies. They can test models about how this works. This year we have a $1 million grant, much less than $2 billion, of course, for states this summer to look at feasibility studies, states and municipalities, not just states, cities as well, because we know there are so many people on the ground who figured this out. This is not a partisan issue. In the countries where these issues are really not issues, I guess, in some cases, we know that it isn't a conservative, it isn't a liberal issue. This is really about making sure that we can prosper as a nation and that workers have the ability to contribute to their economies and to survive. About 75% of women entering the workforce were experienced at least one pregnancy while employed. One of the things we're extremely proud about is that almost 30 million women did not have access to preventative care services without cost sharing before the ACA. Under the ACA, most health insurance plans required to provide breastfeeding support, equipment, and counseling for pregnant and nursing mothers. We want to make it easier, not harder, to be successful at work and successful at home. Right here in Portland, your city council passed an ordinance to require paid sick days, and now the state of Oregon is considering following suit. Many of the folks championing both efforts, including the folks at Family Forward Oregon, are here today, so let's give them a round of applause. I know we have businesses in the room, we have workers, and Jeanette, who tells her story about the cost of not having paid leave. We have a business owner, Franz Spielvogel from the Laughing Planet Cafe here, who also doesn't just say, this is a business imperative, it's the right thing to do. And we know that while ultimately we have charts and scores of studies that we'll continue to produce and we'll continue to talk about, but at the end of the day, the more I talk to, the more the Secretary talks to businesses and even governments about why these issues are important, it's never the case, it's very rarely the case, that the answer is, well, it's good for my bottom line. We know that when we're trying to move these policies forward, we have to have a very strong economic analysis, and we do. But to change the conversation, we have to start saying, this is the right thing to do. And some businesses, the businesses and the business leaders and the organizers who come to us and say, we want to tell our story, I can tell you, there are just countless reports of people saying, this is just part of the fiber of who we are. We've changed our DNA because it's the right thing to do. But we can also show that it's good for our business. And I think those two conversations have to come together. Through our continued effort toward our shared goals, I know we will give working families and the mothers who are often at their centers the backing they need to succeed, both as professionals and as champions of their entire families. I'm so grateful, and I know that the President is grateful, Valerie Jarrett is grateful, and Tom Perez is grateful. that you are championing those issues today in Oregon for women, as are so many other states and cities across the country. President Obama has said, when women succeed, America succeeds. And I'm going to add one thing to that and say, when mothers succeed, America succeeds. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Sunny Pettit. I'm Executive Director at the Center for Women's Leadership, and I'm thrilled to be here today. Thank you so much for your words of wisdom. I'm going to be moderating this panel with some experts from Oregon, as you've heard. But first, Director Lyles, I would love to ask you a few follow-up questions. One is, President Obama discussed many of the struggles families across the country are facing in a State of the Union address this year. The need for paid sick days, paid family leave, affordable child care, family-friendly work arrangements. Why is this becoming an increasing focus for the White House?
Well, again, there's a lot we know we can do in Washington, and I know that there are a lot of people who want us to be able to say that we can make a change at the federal level. We want to be able to say that we can do this for all workers across the country. The momentum that has built in states and cities across this country is unprecedented. In the past year, there have been an unprecedented number of cities who have been successful in implementing or passing paid sick days laws, for example. And we feel that we have a unique and ripe opportunity that we can't afford to not take advantage of. Knowing that where there is momentum frequently, historically in this country at the ground level, we've seen it across several issues. We're advocating as well for an increase in the minimum wage, and we know that states across this country are leading the way. And we feel very strongly that on this issue, the people are going to have to speak first. And so we want to make sure that we can put this front and center in every way that we can, not just education, but funding, and even being able to provide assistance to those folks who are interested in making this work.
What's your next stop on the legislative tour?
Okay, so we started our tour in Washington. The secretary was out. I'm going to be in Los Angeles tomorrow, talking to tradeswomen, and we know we had a Philadelphia trip a couple of weeks ago, and then there's going to be a Minnesota coming up soon with the secretary. So we're getting out there, and our momentum around this in the next couple of months is really going to be to build as much of a crescendo as we possibly can. So in addition to my boss, the Secretary of Labor, and Valerie Jarrett, other leaders in the department and the White House, like myself, are also taking this opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And you kind of addressed this, but what is the role that you see local governments, and are there leading local governments that you see around the state that are really pushing this forward for mothers?
Well, I think this is probably the case here, but it's been so remarkable to see the breadth of the coalition around paid leave and paid sick days. I have spoken with health organizations, child care advocates, mental health organizations, business communities. I think that the power in the diversity of the coalition around issues which we frankly feel are basic issues, they're not add-ons, they're not benefits, is really what is the most powerful thing that we need to continue to try to replicate across this country. And I know that the coalition here in Oregon represents that broad diversity that is really going to be critical for success.
Thank you. So Andrea Peluso, Executive Director of Family Forward Oregon, who recently was just acknowledged by and won this award for being a White House Champion of Change. I wanted to ask you, tell us, your work with Family Forward Oregon is very focused around mothers. Why is the economic status of mothers such a focus of your work?
Well, we were an organization founded by Oregon mothers. We all came together because we were experiencing personally a lot of the things that Director Lyles described, had experienced discrimination at work due to our caregiving responsibilities, struggled to afford childcare, didn't have access to leave. struggled to have flexibility or predictability in our schedules, and we came together and felt like there was a need to really start to address these issues at a much higher level in Oregon. As we came together, we decided one of the driving things would be to try to improve the economic security and circumstances of mothers, knowing that that has impacts on whole families. And we also really wanted to point out that we think we, as a country, as a state, really undervalue caregiving. That caregiving is really important work. It's important for families, it's important for our communities, it's important for our state's budget, and that we don't value it with the way that we design our public policies for either paid or unpaid caregivers, frankly. So when we began the work, we were really alarmed by the fact that motherhood is known as a leading predictor of poverty in old age in this country. Why is that? Because while women face wage gaps, mothers face even greater wage gaps during their working years. They have barriers to keeping jobs like not having paid leave or not having affordable childcare. They have jobs that have fewer options to save for retirement. When they take time away from work, they're not earning Social Security. So there are a variety of things that compound over time and lead to economic insecurity in old age. The other startling thing that I think most folks already know is that single motherhood is a leading predictor of poverty at any time. In Multnomah County, our last census data from 2010 showed that just about half of female-headed households with kids under 18 live in poverty in this county. And just for folks' knowledge, for a family of 3, the poverty line is around $20,000 a year. For a family of 4, it's about $24,000 a year. So about half of female-headed households in our county are living at those levels of income or below. This compared to just 20% of families broadly with kids under 18. So you can see that for single mother-headed households, things are quite a bit harder. And those numbers are basically reflected in counties across the state and are similar to what we see statewide. And they're usually higher for women with kids under 5, because when women have younger kids, that's when they see the greatest degree of this work-family conflict. So those numbers often increase as women find less ability to stay connected to jobs. Even more startling, I think, is a Coalition for Communities of Color report a couple of years ago that came out said that for mothers of color in female-headed households with young kids, that 84% of those mothers are living below the poverty line in our county. And I think that we should be really talking about that as a humanitarian crisis. The fact that we don't, it is. Why? Because we see the compounding effects of racism, of maternal walls and maternal struggles, and of that compounding issue of having young children. And as Director Lyles said, often we hear folks say as we do this work, well, these women, these mothers should just make different choices, different jobs, wait longer to have kids, all of these personal sort of attacks. And we feel like this isn't really about choice. When you see numbers at that level, what we're talking about is a systems problem. We need to change public structures to make things work better for mothers. And that's going to take all of us really working together to do that. Thank you. So it's not about us, right? Our wages are not paying us enough to afford high-quality childcare. Last year, Oregon was rated the least affordable state in the country for center-based infant and toddler care. The average cost of that care is about $12,000 a year, which constitutes 18% of a married couple's, the median income of married couples in this state. But it constitutes over 60% of the median income for single mothers in this state. It's sort of known that now the average cost of childcare exceeds the cost of sending your kids to college by 60%. We lack flexibility in our jobs to meet our caregiving demands. We might lose our jobs because we get the flu or have a kid that gets the flu. We have to return often to work right after having a baby because we can't afford to take unpaid leave or don't qualify for it. I think at this point we can say we're not choosing when we sometimes opt out of work. Sometimes you just do the math and it doesn't add up anymore. And often I think while we say that mothers have a choice about being home or being at work, the reality is that mothers and fathers are really just making decisions, not really choices, in a really confined set of decision points. We're stressed out, we're overworked, we're underpaid, we're undervalued, and the reality is that countries all over the world do this differently. There is a better way to do this.
So why are motherhood and poverty so interconnected?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think the first is that we're still really ambivalent, frankly, as a country about whether or not mothers should be working. Even though we've seen mothers move into the workforce in record numbers, there are some families where mothers were always working, right? But over the last couple of decades, we've seen more and more households where all available adults are in the workforce. And I think we haven't quite dealt with our sort of cultural attitudes about mothers and work. I think that's a huge reason. We still really design most of our public policy with the idea of the full-time breadwinning dad and the full-time stay-at-home mom. And the reality now is that fewer than 20% of families are structured in that way. But our policies are still very much designed with that kind of family in mind. I think, one of the things that we like to say is, in Oregon, I think we talk a lot, we talk enough, we talk some, maybe not enough, about children living in poverty. And the reality is that kids live in poverty mostly because their moms live in poverty. And we can do some things to resolve childhood poverty in the longer term, but that takes us down sort of a different path with regard to public policy than if what we're trying to address is maternal poverty. That takes you down a really different road where you need to start thinking about the structures we build around jobs that make it possible for women to keep them. And that's, I think, what we hope to be really focusing on today. And I think the last thing I'll say is that, how many of you have seen over the last year or two articles about women who have had their kids removed from their care because they left them in a car during a job interview, because they had them playing at a park while they worked at the McDonald's next door? We have a choice to make as a country about whether we continue to criminalize the poverty that mothers experience or whether we choose to spend those dollars instead on building structures around work like childcare.
So we hear a lot about equal pay and pay equity these days, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the maternal wage gap.
Yeah, so the national data is that women earn 78 cents on the dollar. This is for full-time workers, and you can measure that a lot of different ways and come up with different numbers, but the reality is that no matter how you measure it, there are wage gaps. So that is a fact. And for women of color and for mothers broadly, those numbers are lower. So April 14th recently was the day in 2015 when women finally, on average, made what men made last year in 2014. So we celebrated, we kind of celebrated Unequal Pay Day. For mothers, that date would have been June 4th this year. For African American women, that would have been July 27th. For Native American women, it would be September 8th. And for Latinas, it would be October 8th. That's how long it would take for those women to earn what men averaged in earnings in 2014. So we see these wage gaps for a couple of different reasons. One is that women still face discrimination at work, often related to their family caregiving responsibilities. We see this gap persist even for women who are recent college graduates. That's just discrimination at that point. We also see it because the work that is primarily done by women is still undervalued and not paid the same as work that is traditionally and primarily done by men, even if it requires the same education, skills, training. And then we also see it because we continue to lack those structures that we build around jobs that make it possible for women to really compete equally for wages and promotions, things like leave, things like childcare. There's a lot of things that we can do about it. Employers can really institute a lot of internal best practices to ensure equal treatment, equal pay. We can also advocate for those policies that wrap around work. And the other thing I think I would want to say is we can really try to help more men take advantage of these things and fight for these things, because the more men are accessing leave to take care of kids, which I have to say generationally more and more of them want to be doing, the more we level the playing field on that front as well.
So now, Eileen, I'd like to turn to you. Eileen is an epidemiologist from Multnomah County and recently helped put together the first ever Multnomah County maternal, family, and child health data book. And it had some really startling statistics, especially on maternal health and birth outcomes among poor mothers and mothers of color. Can you talk a little bit more about these findings and what they signify?
Sure. Thanks, Sunny. First, I feel like I need to recognize my Multnomah County Health Department colleagues who worked on the data book. They worked probably 10 times harder than I did, which means that if any mistakes that you make, you can look to them for any corrections or edits. I think that the data book basically tells us that poor moms and moms of color are not doing well, as well as the children that are being born to these moms. A little bit about the data book. It's organized using something called the life course perspective, which posits that things, periods of our life that we oftentimes think is separate, so infancy, adolescence, adulthood, being, an elder, the life course perspective actually posits that all of these stages are interconnected, so that your health in your infancy will affect your health in your adolescence, which will affect your health as an adult, which will eventually affect your health as an elder. And so this really speaks to a lot to what Dr. Wallach talked about last week about epigenetics. That if you are, you have poor health as a child, as a girl, and then you end up getting pregnant, your poor health will end up being transmitted to your child. And then so forth along the lines across your life course. And so the data book really looks at a particular section of the life course. So it looks at the preconception period all the way through the postpartum period, which is intrinsically linked also to your health that happens when you're a child. And so what we find in the data book across these periods is you find tremendous disparities by race as well as economic status across almost every single indicator that we see. So ranging from preconception health, so looking at things like pregnancy intentionality, which is directly correlated to your access to family planning services and contraceptive services, and your ability to afford those services, as well as your pregnancy health, so different things like your multivitamin intake or your folate intake, different health behaviors that you might have during your pregnancy, birth outcomes, so whether or not your child will be low birth weight, premature, or experience death before the age of 1, which is called infant mortality, all the way up to postpartum health, like experiencing postpartum depression. So we really look at things across the life course, and what we're seeing is there's just tremendous inequality and disparities that we see across all of these different indicators in the data book. And what this signifies is that the same disparities that we see in our 2014 Racial Disparities Report Card, which looks at different chronic diseases and different other health conditions among different populations, is that we see the same disparities there. So if you look at the data, the Maternal Child Family Health Data Book, and you look at our recent disparities report card, you can almost see those reports as being connected to each other. Because if you have poor health, your mom has poor health, and then you end up being low birth weight or premature, you are more susceptible to chronic diseases in the end. So this burden of disease and disparity is being experienced and disproportionately experienced among poor mothers and mothers of color in the county, as well as across the state. So infant mortality, which is kind of used as this kind of universal indicator of community health, we see that in our county, African American babies and Native American babies are twice more likely to die just on the basis of the community that they come from. So imagine that just the fact that, if you're an African American mom or you're a Native mom, your child from the time that it is born is twice more likely to die than your white counterparts. It's almost as if, from birth, you're automatically marked for an early death, as well as experiencing different chronic diseases. So another thing that I really want to address in the data book is, so we look at a lot of things like, smoking during pregnancy and drinking during pregnancy, and things that a lot of people really attribute to these kind of individual behaviors. And if you only didn't smoke, if you only didn't drink, you have a choice to do that. So there's a saying in public health that the choices that you make are circumscribed by the choices that you have. So that if you want to be healthy, you want to eat organic foods, maybe you want to eat gluten-free, since you live in Portland. If the nearest grocery store is 2 bus rides away, and all you have, within walking distance are these tiny, liquor stores that sell predominantly processed food, you really don't have that choice available to make. You can't make the choice to be healthy. You can't make the choice to, with regard to drinking and smoking, those are oftentimes used as coping mechanisms. If you can't go and take a walk because in your neighborhood it's not safe and you don't have sidewalks, and in East Multnomah County, I saw a survey recently where people said that was the number one concern, was that we need sidewalks, which is something that a lot of us, I think, take for granted. You will find other alternative ways of coping, and unfortunately that may end up being unhealthy means of coping, such as drinking or smoking or eating junk food and whatnot. So I think that when you look at the data book, really look at it in the context of the life course perspective, but also look at it in terms of these kind of systematic, structural, contextual things that are happening, and that a lot of things that moms would like to do to have a healthy pregnancy and to have a healthy child, they don't have the opportunity to make those choices.
Eileen, I'm wondering, do you expect that the data that you found from the Multnomah County Data Book, is that similar, do you think, to the rest of the state?
So what's really interesting is that I think that people in Portland and people in Multnomah County often think of themselves as an outlier, right? Because we oftentimes think of ourselves as being very progressive and very aware of things. But what's really interesting is that the same disparities that we see in maternal-child health in Multnomah County, we see across the state. And you see it especially in counties with larger populations of communities of color, so maybe Lane County, where Eugene is, and Marion County, which has Salem. And then the state also, we see the same infant mortality rates as if you look at the state as a whole. So in the state of Oregon, between 2009 and 2013, the infant mortality rate among white infants was 4.7 per 1,000 births, which is actually lower than the national infant mortality rate. But for African Americans, it's 8.3. And then for Native moms, American Indian and Alaskan Natives, it's 10.6. So, our state is not unique in that way. You go to New York, you look at their data, you look at California's data, it's the same disparity in infant mortality that you see. So, in many ways, the state and Multnomah County really mirror what's happening nationally when it comes to maternal-child family health.
It's so interesting because I think what I hear all of you saying is talking about the difference of individual versus structural inequities and how those things are coming together. And with that, I would like to go to kind of a last question. And one of the things that I would love to hear is, what is the one thing that you could do to make lives for mothers in Oregon or in the country better? What's one thing you would do?
Well, one thing that's happening right now is we are trying to pass a law in Oregon to require sick days for all workers in Oregon. So that's something we're very excited to see happen. You can all help. And I would say but a longer term thing is I do think we really have to work hard for all of us in the way we talk about this stuff, in the way we work on these things to get out of that individual mindset. I think so many of us are struggling with these issues, and we talk about it like we're alone. And the reality is that we're all facing these things in some way. And if we talk about it in that way, it really builds power toward a different kind of solution. I do want to say that, we talk to folks all over the state all the time about their experiences with these issues. And because there's a radio audience, I want to say, if you have an experience with one of these issues, or for folks in the room, and you want to tell us about it so we can use it in some of the work that we do to advocate for different policy, you can text the word story to the number 25872 and get involved with this work in a longer term way.
So for me, I think that the one thing that you can actually do right now, even from your seats, is to educate yourselves about what's happening in Baltimore. Because the same root causes for that uprising, the same inequality, the same discrimination, are the root causes that we see here for the poor health of moms that are poor, moms of color, all of our families, especially those from communities of color. And go and understand what these forces are, understand that these are happening here in Multnomah County, here in Oregon. And this is what really underlies, this is the root cause of disparities, is inequalities, fundamental, deep-rooted historical inequality in our institutions and in our structures. And don't be complacent. So the data, I know I'm probably running over time, but the data that we see, the disparities data in almost every health condition, this has been going on a really long time, and I am surprised that we are not more outraged. I'm surprised that we are not taking to the streets and being like, this cannot happen to our African American communities, to our Latino communities, to our Native communities, to our Asian Pacific Islander communities. I think the problem is that we are beginning to normalize the disparities that we see. Of course, African American infant mortality is twice that of whites, because it's been like that for a long time, but that's why we need to be really taking action now.
Thank you. Director Lyles.
Sure. So just building a little bit off of a couple of points from the panel. In particular, you talked about the wage gap. You talked about equal pay. You talked about racial disparity. This was a conversation that we had at the department with a foreign leader whom we're talking about how you were able to do this in your country. And thinking very much about the economics of these issues, in particular childcare and paid leave. And she said, this is a very high-ranking woman, she said, she's a European country, in the United States, you value equality. More women graduate at higher levels. They have better education. They are working at higher numbers than ever before. If it's not an equality issue, then what is it? And I think that this discussion about how for so long we've talked about these as women's issues goes very much to what the other panelists are saying. And so on the one hand, looking at it very much from that lens is incredibly important for the societal and the change that we have to make around attitudes, how we value care, how we value caregiving. And on the other hand, we feel very strongly that we can get paid leave in this country. We can get sick days in this country. We believe it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And we know that the more we do in communities like Portland, the closer we are to making that a reality.
Thank you. So I think now we are going to have some City Club members come up to the microphone and ask some questions. And I think the first questions are going to come from some of our civic scholars who are here from Madison High School. Yay!
Hi. Hi, I'm Jenna Peden-Higgins, Civic Scholar from Madison, and I was wondering, when you can't afford, per se, child care providers who will watch your children while you're at work, how often do you think they put them in front of a screen? So how do you know the child care you're getting isn't harming your children's development?
I'm happy to answer that question. I think that there are a lot of parents out there who are choosing childcare that they know isn't the highest quality childcare, and they're often choosing it because it's what they can afford. And I think you're pointing out that there are a lot of childcare arrangements that aren't ideal for families. They're not going to produce the best possible long-term outcomes for those kids. And so I think the question for us is, how much longer are we willing to go as a country, as a state, without a real child care system that addresses that problem?
Hi, Julia Hackle from Madison Civic Scholars. I was wondering why you think we criminalize women in poverty as much as we do as a society.
That's a great question. Do you guys want me to take it? I'll take it again. Sorry, I don't want to take all the questions. I think that we criminalize everything in this country. So that's just one thing. I think that when we live in an era of mass incarceration, as we do, and we have for-profit structures associated with that like one of our defaults has become criminalizing behaviors that are not criminal behaviors. When you are living in poverty, you often have very few choices about how you make ends meet, how you structure your life. And I think those obviously are the really systemic sort of questions that we need to ask about how we allow folks to have lives that are with economic opportunity, where you are not facing the potential for criminal activity in the way that we see folks, and also where you have access to those basic structures like childcare, so that you don't have to leave your kids unattended and you can keep your job.
And I'll add something that connects both questions actually together, and that is the president called for universal pre-K and preschool and investments in the next budget for states to explore childcare options that can be institutionalized. And in addition to the question about the criminalization of the parents, I think there is just an off-the-chart benefit to making sure that our children are not themselves too on a path, or we call it, the pipeline problem that we have. And it's a very, very scary and endless loop. And one of the very key interventions that we know works is making sure that there's quality childcare and education at the earliest levels. And it definitely goes back to what you said about that's going to be key in ending the cycle.
Following up, I'm Carol Witherell, City Club member. Following up on those responses and systemic solutions, there's no question there's been a hugely disproportionate impact of mass incarceration on families of color and poverty, and that affects men, women, children, all. Do you see anything on the horizon in Washington with the president's actions and the judicial system's reforms that would end the sentences of people who were incarcerated for low-level nonviolent crimes with long sentences, and returning the monies that are saved by closing prisons to supporting families and addressing the school to prison pipeline? Thank you.
So one additional point that I'll make is that this administration has been, from the very, very beginning, committed to making sure that, obviously, stemming the tide of young people in prison is critical. But even for folks that go in to prison for short periods of time for nonviolent offenses, one of the things that the Secretary of Labor and the President have committed to is making sure that we have real options for people. When we say re-entry, it means We want you to re-enter our communities, and that means good jobs, job training, and not making black marks on people's records so that they can't ever really get a leg up. And I think the key for us in a system that we know in so many ways is broken on the back end is what we can do to really invest in strong reentry programs, including, I don't know what the situation here is in Oregon, but we know that so many formerly incarcerated men and women aren't able to get jobs. They're not able to get jobs. They're not able to turn their lives around, even if they want to, and that's one of the things that we have to change as well.
And I'll add to that we should note that, obviously a primary thing is to decriminalize most of the stuff in the first place to prevent folks from having, interactions with the criminal justice system. But there are a couple of key things going on right now in the legislature. One is that we are working on an alternate sentencing program. Representative Williamson is advocating this, that would allow for parents and especially mothers to have alternatives to prison so they can stay connected to their families. The second is that we are working to protect the family preservation program at Coffee Creek, which, yes, has done a fantastic job of keeping women and their children united during the time that they're incarcerated so that they can stay together as a family when they leave. And then two other things are that we are part of the Fair Shot for All Coalition and have been working in partnership with a couple of key partners, including the Urban League of Portland, who are here, and the Center for Intercultural Organizing, to pass laws that prevent police profiling by race, religion, sexual orientation, and also that ban the box, or sort of, remove those questions from an employment process about your criminal history unless it's relevant to the job you're applying for, so that's happening both at a conversation about that in Portland and at the state level to allow those who do have an arrest record to access employment.
Hi, Kalpana Krishnamurthy, City Club member. Happy early Mother's Day to everybody in this room. I work for an organization that put these postcards out on the tables with these beautiful images because for me, I've never been able to find a Mother's Day card that reflects my family. And one of the challenges, so the Mama's Day campaign lets people do that, find beautiful art that matches their lived experiences of their families to honor the parents and the moms in their lives. But one of the challenges with policymaking is that too often we continue to make policy like we have a specific kind of family. It's a two-parent family. It's a family where a mom stays at home. It's a white family. It's a straight family. How do we actually change that narrative in the culture and for policymakers so that they can see the visible families and mamas in our communities, so that we're making policies in a way that incorporates all the folks who actually live here? What other culture change and policy change needs to happen so that those families are actually visible?
I think that's a really, really great question, and it's actually something that has been on my mind for a long time, since single motherhood is often used as a primary indicator of a child's health. So a lot of research says that, being a single mom, you're more prone to mental illness, different chronic diseases and stress and whatnot. But the problem is not inherent to single moms. There's nothing wrong with being a single mother. The problem is that we live in a culture and a political context that does not value diverse families. I grew up in a family where my grandparents lived with us, and my grandmother and my grandfather were primary caregivers. So in this notion of the standard North American family, and there's actually been a lot of literature about research and literature on that, I wouldn't fit in that particular that framework. So I think that we just really need to have a paradigm shift and realize that something that we think is, inherently wrong or morally wrong, like being a single mom, we make it hard for single moms to survive because we do not value and honor the way that their family is structured. So it really goes to just changing the way we talk about these things. If we're going to talk about something like single parenthood or single motherhood as an indicator of poor health, we need to look at it in the context of the fact that a lot of these poor moms, mothers of color, do not have a lot of choices available to them. You know, women in Oregon make less than men. Women of color make even less than white women in Oregon. You know, access to childcare, you know, even just cultural perceptions of single mothers being deviant and whatnot. And I think what's also really interesting is that we also need to think in terms of the interventions that we're going to pursue. So, you know, if we think about, okay, if single motherhood is a problem, what's your intervention going to be? It's going to be marriage. I was talking to some folks and they're like, I asked them that question, you know, what's the intervention that we get from this data when it's not contextualized in the correct way? It's a Match.com membership, right? Because with this data, we're saying to moms, there's something wrong with you being a single mom. There's something wrong with your family. When in actuality, just like race, single motherhood being wrong is a complete social construction. So we need that culture shift.
I just want to add one really short thing, and I'm, you know, I know we're on radio, and I'm sure she would be okay with my saying this, but I've been so proud to be able to work on these issues. Valerie Jarrett, who couldn't be here today, often opens up these conversations by saying she was a single mom, and talks about it openly as the context of her experience, which I know we also don't do in advocacy. We don't talk from our experience. And it has been a very, very powerful change in how we approach these issues, in part because we do often policymaking without the reality of the people that are going to be affected by these policies. So I think an acknowledgement across the board in leadership, lawmakers, and others would probably show that, you know, the realities are present in all of our lives. We just have this vision of the world that is perpetuated that most of us don't experience. So I agree on the cultural shifts, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Oh, and I think we have time for one more question.
Bill Dickey, City Club member, progressive employer. I think one of the things I think, when you're talking about your paradigm shift, I think that the shift needs to come from the entire population. The problem is, I mean, I offer sick pay to my employees. I have an employee in the hospital right now with viral pneumonia, and she worked herself to the point of nearly dropping on the job, and I said, go to the doctor, go home. And even when I was talking to her at the hospital, she's so concerned about coming back to work. And I said, look, I'm paying you to stay home. I'm not even taking this, it's not sick pay, this is bonus pay. You know, don't think about the money, get healthy. But her, I mean, she has these benefits, but her instinct is to be, you know, at her work, to not let the job down, to not let her employer down. And I think that this shift has to come from, you know, like early on, to get these people to think that they have this right to get sick and not have to come to work.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. I just want to quickly acknowledge Bill Dickey and Morel Inc. in their ongoing advocacy, actually, for workers across the city and the state for these kinds of fair standards. And I agree with you. I mean, these are huge culture changes that we need to make. Part of the way we make them is by making sure that it isn't that employees are winning a boss lottery and that's how they have access to these things, but that they are universally available to folks, and then we can all feel secure in taking using these benefits and having access to them. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Karen?
We have run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. As we close, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to Latifah Lyles, Andrea Peluso, Dr. Eileen Dudelau, and Sunny Pettit.